This is part 3 of a series on building a full-stack web application using Spring Boot and React, where you get to watch every line of code being written and a full app built from the scratch, step by step. Go watch. If you're new, start watching from this video. Okay, now we need to tell Spring Boot to execute it, the Spring Batch to execute it. Let's see what this says. All right, person item processor implements Spring Batch's item processor interface. This makes it easy to wire in code into your batch job that you will define later in the guide. According to the interface, you will receive an incoming person object, after which you will transform to an uppercase person, which was the transformation they're doing there. In their case, the input and the output structure is the same. So they just use the person class. In our case, the input and the output structures are different, which is why we have two separate classes. Put together a batch job. Okay. We need to put together an actual batch job. Spring Batch provides many utility classes that reduce the need to write custom code. Instead, you can focus on business logic. Batch configuration, right? Batch processing, batch configuration. All right, this uses the Spring configuration annotation and says enable batch processing. All right, so Spring Boot is actually looking for a class with this annotation to say, hey, this is a batch processing job and I need to do something there. I'm going to create a new file called batch config.java, not match config, batch config.java. And then this here, it's batch config.java. And yeah, that should do it. So there are two factory classes that it auto wires. I'm going to auto import everything. Two factory classes. One is job builder factory and one is step builder factory. Okay, let's see what to do next. For starters, enable batch processing annotation adds many critical beans that support jobs and save you a lot of legwork. Okay, this example uses a memory-based database provided by enable batch processing, meaning when it's done, the data is gone. This is not true in our case because we have a web application, so the application doesn't end until we kill it. Okay, so the reason they're saying this is if you use a command line application with Spring Boot and you use an in-memory database, well, the command line application is going to end when it's done doing what it's supposed to do, and the in-memory database goes away. But when does the web application end? It doesn't have a job to do and then it ends, right? The web application needs to run for as long as it needs to be up, right? So that's the reason why we can use an in-memory database in our case and still have the database exist. We populate it when the application starts and then it's going to stay there. It's going to serve requests and all that. And when we kill the application, then the database goes away, which is fine. We don't need it, right? When we start up another application, another instance of the app, the database gets populated again. So we should be good. Autowire a couple of factories that's needed further. Now let's add beans to the batch configuration class to define a reader, processor, and a writer. Yeah, this is what Spring Batch does. It needs 3 beans, okay? So you define one bean, which takes input, right? Knows where to read from. We need to tell it, hey, read a line from the CSV file. And you have a processor. What does the processor do? It has to call this method that we wrote, okay? We convert from one to the other. And then third is a writer. And what do we need to tell the writer? We need to tell it, hey, write to this in-memory database. Okay, so we need to define those 3 things here. Okay, so I'm going to copy this and tweak it. All right, so here are the 3 things: the input, the reader, the processor, and the writer. I'll put this over here. These are bean definitions. All right, you see this? It's annotated with add bean, so this knows what needs to be done. I'm going to format document with Java formatter support. Okay. And what do we need to do here? First, let's import everything. All right. Import data source from Java SQL data source, which is what we need. And all the person will be replaced with match. Well, no, actually, that's not quite right. When you're reading something, well, we'll come to that, okay? When you're reading something, you're basically telling it to read from a CSV file, and then you're telling it what are the fields it needs to read, and then what is the class, the target type class that it needs to convert. Okay, we need to say, hey, read from match data. Okay, all the fields that we have, it has to read all of them, and then it has to set the target type to match input.class. Okay, you remember we are basically using match input as a holder of our input type from the CSV file. So this has to be match input. This one has to be match input as well. So wherever we're reading, it all has to be match input because we're reading match input. Okay, now what are the fields? We need to put all the fields here. So I'm going to move it somewhere over here, right? So I'm going to have this be a constant. Private final string array field names equals this guy here. I'm going to put all the field names here, okay? And let me get the field names from the CSV file, right? We need all these fields. Let's read everything. This guy here. And it has to be a bunch of strings. So I'm again going to select all the commas. If you're following along with VS Code, the shortcut is Control D or Command D, and you'll be able to select multi-cursor, right? You'll be able to select all the commas. And I can use arrows and move all these cursors at the same time, which is handy. Okay, so I'm going to put a quote here and then a quote at the end of the previous one. And now we have double quote separated string values, which is awesome. Now we have an array of field names here. We're going to use these field names in here, which is what the example was using, right? What was the example using? It was using a string array of fields that it needs to read. Okay, now I've got all the fields that are in the CSV data, kind of define that in this field names array. And then I'm using that over here. And then I'm saying, hey, once you get each element, create the match input class instance from each input value. All right. It's delimited, so it knows it's CSV files. Okay, so that's the input part. Next is the processor part. Now it needs to process this thing. Now, what is the processor? It basically needs to return an instance of the processor that we have, all right? What do we call this? We call this match data processor. Okay, just gonna create an instance of this thing. Okay, it's created a bean and it says, hey, here is the processor. It knows what to do, right? How does it know what to do? Because we've written the logic. We've written the logic to take match input and create a match output. Now, the final thing that's left is to write that to a database, which is where the match record is fine. And this is perfect. It's going to take each value, and then you basically have a JDBC batch item writer builder, which is going to write this value to the database. Now, again, it has to be these fields, right? It cannot be, this is the example one, first name and last name. It needs to be our fields. And then these need to be the properties of our class. Okay, let me actually do this. Insert into people. So this is going to be match. I'm going to create a new table called match. We didn't create the table. Oh, yes. How do we do this? There are a couple of options for us. We can create a table and have it be ready for these inserts to happen to that table. Or I can use JPA, okay? Here's my match model. Rather than having to create a table and mess with the SQL ourselves, I'm just gonna map it with @entity, okay? When I map it with that entity, what happens? JPA is going to create this table, right? I'm gonna do a couple more things. I'm gonna make this @ID so that it knows that this is an identifier, right? It's a table ID, primary key, and that should be it. So when the application starts, it is going to create this match table with all these fields, okay? So that's perfect, which is what we need. So now that it has created those fields need to be available over here, right? So it needs to say, okay, get those field values and put them over here. So I'm going to get these values. Okay, let me create a new file and play around with this over here. Everything is string except for these ones, which, okay. So I have all these lined up. I can select all this stuff, remove this, and then make it comma separated. Okay, you see what I'm doing here? I'm basically selecting all the values using multi-cursor. It's very handy when you want to do things like this. Yeah, all right. And then now I have a comma separated list of fields, which I can paste over here, right? Insert into match these fields. I'm going to have to change from camel case to underscore case because that's what JPA does by default. When you have properties, how is the table created? We're basically telling JPA to say, hey, take from this and create the table, right? Now it has camel case. JPA by default converts camel case to underscore cases. So the table is going to have underscore cases. So when we're saying, hey, insert into this, we need to have underscore cases. We could probably do like an entity manager persist over here, but I'm just going to follow this example and then use SQL, which is why we are messing with this. Okay, so player of match is going to be underscore case. Anything that has camel case will need to be underscore case here. Toss underscore winner, toss underscore decision. Result underscore margin. This was an unintended copy paste. Umpire 1, umpire 2. This should do it. And now the values will be the fields without the conversion to camel case, underscore case. All right. So these are the fields, and it has to be. I think there has to be a colon at the front. Yeah, there has to be a colon in the front to refer to the field name. Okay, so I'm gonna just stick a colon here to all these guys. Okay, and then all these guys go over here. And I'm gonna put this over here. These are the values that need to be inserted. Okay, so what are we doing here? We are doing a write operation where we get a match instance, and we are doing insert into the match table. Well, these are the column names in the match table. How did we get that? We got that because those are the property names over here, except that camel case will be converted to underscore case by default. Now, what are the values that need to be inserted? Well, it just needs to pick up those property names from the match instance, which is what we're doing over here. Okay, save, and this should be good. Why is it complaining? Match cannot be resolved to a type. We're gonna have to import it from the model package, and this should be it. So with this, we have a reader, we have a processor, and we have a writer. Now this is going to do this every time, and for each line, it is going to call the processor, and the processor is going to convert from the input type to whatever match type that we need. Okay, moving on. There is, I think, one or two last steps that need to be performed. Okay, so now we have defined what to read, how to process, and what to write. How to read, how to process, and how to write. So now we need to create a job which basically does the read, process, and write. Okay, we need to tell Spring Batch, hey, I'm going to create a job with this particular step, where the step is to read, process, and write. Okay. So this is the structure of Spring Batch. Okay, any Spring Batch thing is you basically create a job. Job consists of multiple steps, and each step is basically input, process, and write. Okay. Now I'm again going to copy paste this. I'm going to create this. This is also going to batch configuration.java. Again, I'm going to copy this and paste this to batch config. All right, and then format this again. Okay, and then fix all the imports. Step is Spring Framework batch step, Spring Framework batch job. Okay. There is a listener which basically runs when you complete the job. You're basically asking you to run a particular method and you say, hey, tell me when the job is complete. I think that's what this guy is. And you basically give it the steps. Well, you just need to run step 1, which is basically a bean over here, which you're injecting over here. Okay, so what is step 1? Step 1 is write this thing. Oh, it's everything, right? It has to do a reader, processor, and writer. It's doing all of them, okay, which is great. Now this is going to be match, and then this is match input, and then match. Again, it's the same thing, right? Input and output. Okay, I'm going to use this convention here so that it becomes a little easier to understand. Since it's chaining methods, it helps to do this. Dot build. Okay. And then even here, step 1. And then it's going to chunk 10 items at a time. It is going to read using the reader. It is going to process using the processor. And it is going to write using the writer. And then it is going to build. I have no idea why only the writer is an argument and the others are not. The others are just beans, right? So here you see, there's a reader, there's a bean, processor is a bean, writer is a bean too. So I have no idea why they have this as an argument. Well, anyway, I'm just copy pasting the code. So what we have done here is we're basically saying, hey, this is a user job, and you have ID incrementer for incrementing the ID of each step in the job, like each ID in the job. And then you have listener. Each flow is the flow of the job is basically just one step, step 1, and then end, and then build. Okay. We don't have a listener yet. We're going to build that later. We need to say, hey, I need to know when the job is done. So that's what this listener is. We're going to get back to that in a bit. But step 1 is basically doing what we want it to do, right? This is the entirety of the job, okay? Read using the reader, process using the processor, write using the writer. Now build the step. And that's what this is going to get. And then once step 1 is done, it is going to end. Now it is going to build this job, okay? So this is the configuration of the job. This is the configuration of the step, the only step in the job. And then it's going to build the job. This is going to build the step, all right? This is what we have. And now I think what's left is the job completion notification, right? We want to know when the job is done. All right, we are going to find that thing here. Yeah, here's the job completion notification listener. I'm just going to create a new class and pretty much paste that thing there in the data package. Job completion listener.java. Okay, this will do. And I'm gonna paste this and then remove the initial couple of lines so that I get the package. All right, so the package goes, this one goes away. And then this line needs to be this guy. Well, it's the same class name, so this should be good. Just the package name gets over here. And then what are we doing here? We are creating a method called after job. Okay, after job, we say, hey, Spring Boot, run this method after the job is complete, and then give me the job execution so that I can figure out what the status is, right? So I'm going to check for job execution.get status. If the batch status is complete, then, oh, it's running a sample query to get a couple of persons. Okay, we can do this. We can do this. Let's do team 1 and then team 2. And then maybe let's do date from match, okay? And then, yeah, I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to print over here. I'm going to do team 1. What's this? RS. I forget, how do I look it up? rs.getString of 1, okay? And then team 2. rs.getString of 2. And then date. Get string of 3. Okay, this is what I'm going to return over here. And then for each, I'm going to be like, this is the string. I'm going to just print it. That's string. Okay, so what are we doing here? We are waiting for the job to complete. After the job is complete, I'm using JDBC template, which is injected over here, right? It's created this member variable and then doing constructor injection. So Spring Boot is going to auto wire this thing, right? The auto wired annotation here. And now in the after job, it is basically going to do JDBC template.query of 3 fields from our match table. And then using the rs and row, is basically doing rs.getString, getString, getString. It's going to get these 3 values. And then for each one of those, it's going to print that string. I basically created this string over here so that I can print it. Okay, why is this complaining? I don't need the comma there. All right, so now we have, I think we're done with this, okay? So just to recap, we defined a batch job, okay? But I'm gonna go the other way around to recap, okay? We defined a batch job using this, all right? The batch job contains one step, and we define the step over here. What's the step do? It reads using the reader, processes using the processor, and writes using the writer, right? Now we define these to be 3 Spring Beans. All right, let's look at the reader. Reader is a flat file item reader, which basically looks up a CSV file in the class path, which is where, notice here, there's no path here. It's assuming it's a class path. Since we put the file in source main resources, it's going to pick that up from the class path. And then with these field names, it is going to create an instance of match input dot class. Okay, every line is going to create a new match input instance. And this is done. This is the reader. What do we do with the processor? Well, before we go to the processor, what do we do with the writer? Writer doesn't take match input. Writer takes the match instance, which is what our final result, what our final expected state of the data is, right? And what do we do here? We have a bunch of match instances. We are going to insert them into the match table. Okay, we're going to create all these member variables, pull up all these member variables and then create the SQL statement and insert them. Now, who's going to convert from the match input to the match instance? Well, it is going to be our match data processor, which is what we are passing to the processor. What does the match data processor do? It's going to pull up values from the match input and it's going to transform them, process them into the match instance. Okay, and this is the middle part. So now we have a job which takes the CSV, processes, writes to the database. And then when it's done, when the job is done, it is going to call this notification listener, basically saying, hey, listener is this, right? This is the Spring Boot API. It basically expects you to pass a listener, right? You're passing a listener, says, call this thing. What do we have in the listener? We basically check if the batch status is completed. Well, in that case, I'm going to log job finished. And then I'm going to query 3 fields from each row in the table. And for each row, I'm preparing the string, saying team 1 is this, team 2 is this, and then date is this. And then I'm printing that to the console. All right, moment of truth. Let's see if this works. I am going to the Spring Boot dashboard. There are a bunch of ways you can run this if you're in VS Code. You can either start here, or you can go to this main class and then click on run here. Whatever you do, it doesn't matter. Just going to run this thing. Let's see if it prints results. Well, it says application failed to start. It's already running. Okay, well, we're gonna have to kill that first. Yeah, here it is. I'm gonna kill this. And then let's start again. Okay, we get an error here. Let's see what the error is. Number format exception for input string ID. Is there a value here which does not have a number ID? Oh, well, we have the first row, which we don't need, right? We don't need this. We need just the data. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that in my CSV file. It basically failed in the very first row. Okay, it's trying to take the ID, this value, and then trying to convert it into a long or an int. It's not going to work. Okay, so we need to get rid of that first row. Okay, failed to save, resource locked. Why is that? Maybe because I have the Excel sheet open here. So I'm going to remove, I'm going to end this and then ask it to retry. And now it should save. Fine. Okay, let's try this one more time. Okay, it was failing because it was unable to convert the first row into an int, the first name, the first ID. All right, now we get another error. What does this say? Text 418-2008 could not be parsed at index 0. Okay, oh, it's a datetime formatter. It's not able to parse that text. I thought that was the default. Let's take a look. All right, I'm gonna go to matches, component code. Okay, looks like this is the format. I think I saved from Excel, which is why it messed up. All right, so let me do this. I'm going to copy this guy here and then save this here. You notice here I saved in Excel, so it's changed the date format. Well, thank you, Excel. I don't plan to use you again. Okay, so now I removed this part, and now this is the format that should work. Okay, let's try this one more time. Run again. All right, one more error. Bad SQL grammar. What is the error? There seems to be a problem with the SQL. Result ID, object not found result ID. I don't think we have a result ID here, do we? What is this? We don't have result ID. That must be a typo. Okay, let's fix that. So when we are doing the batch config, we are inserting data over here, result. Yeah, this doesn't exist, all right? Well, the whole thing got copied over. Oh man, I don't know how this happened. Let's get rid of this stuff. Result. Okay, this is what we need. Result margin, umpire 1, umpire 2. Now this seems to be fine. Okay, let's try this one more time. And there we have it. There you go. Here are all the teams and the date, right? The teams that have played and the date at which they've played the game. Okay. So now we have all the data in a transformed way, and we have it in a database. So I can basically start up this Spring Boot project that we have in our hands, and it is going to get the CSV file transformed, save it to the database. So I can basically assume that the data exists when I'm building the API, okay?